Lutte International, also known as International Wrestling, was a promotion based in Montreal that operated from 1980 until 1987. Not to be confused with the 1961 French documentary titled La Lutte, filmed and produced in Montreal. It was considered one of the big three promotions in Canada, along with Calgary Stampede and Maple Leaf Wrestling. The promotion was founded by Frank Valois, Andre the Giant, and Gino Brito, as promotion Rougeaus, a combination of all three owners' names. Lutte International succeeded Grand Prix Wrestling, which closed in 1975 and left the city without a major promotion. Capitalizing on the void left, Gino Brito, Andre the Giant, and Andre's manager Frank Valois, the promotion took off. Importing stars from the US to face off with local talent proved to be a winning combination. French-born Andre the Giant considered Montreal his second home, and he had several businesses which operated in the area and was well known. Their first major show was held on August 25, 1980 at the sold-out Paul Soave Center, where Andre the Giant battled Hulk Hogan in the main event. Andre would sell his share in 1984 when he signed full-time to the WWF. Several other individuals would own a piece of the promotion throughout the years, including Dino Bravo, Rick Martel, Tony Mule, Eddie Quinn, and his son Floyd. Many former Grand Prix stars joined the new promotion, including Frenchie Martin, Gilles the Fish Poisson, Len Shelley, Rocky De La Serra, Michel Dubois, Pierre Mad Dog Lefebvre, Serge Dumont, Zeronoff Lebu, and the Rougeau brothers. The influx of major stars helped the promotion obtain a television contract with CFC-FDT shortly after its debut. Inevitably, it faced the same fate as every other major promotion in Canada when WWF took over and lured away most of the top talent with lucrative deals, and was considered the end of the golden age. This is the untold story of Lutte International. It was 1891. As the world's first traveler checks are issued by American Express, the first basketball game is played in Springfield, Massachusetts. The Boston Beaneaters finished the year as National League champions. A lynch mob storms the old parish prison in New Orleans and lynches 11 innocent Italians arrested for the murder of police chief David Hennessy. And one of the first organized wrestling cards was held at the Armory in Montreal. John McMahon, the self-proclaimed collar and elbow champion, tussled with W.C. Quinn to a draw in front of a disappointed crowd. The preliminary matches of the card drew more excitement than the main event, which featured Sailor Brown, Professor Stevenson, Charles McDoyle, and Harry Powers. The Montreal Gazette would report match results on a weekly basis, helping the sport gain new followers and keep longtime fans well informed on match results. Through the late 1800s, other stars that would pass through the area would include Yvonne the Straggler Lewis, Dan McLeod, Harry Moses Dufour, and the Terrible Turk Ismail Yusuf.
Solomon was ruler of the wisest of the nations. He founded that great brotherhood we know as the Freemasons. All Masons are as brothers, rich or poor, they're all akin. Unless a man is tried and true, he cannot enter in. In sickness or in trouble, they are bound to help each other. No matter where a Mason goes, he'll always find a brother.
In 1919, Lucien Riopel won possession of the Jubilee skating rink and was the man behind professional wrestling in Montreal during the late 1920s and into the early part of the 1930s. Sometime in the early 1930s, wrestler Jack Ganson relocated from New York to Montreal and began wrestling in the area. In 1934, disgruntled New York promoter John Hassan Pfeiffer attempted to expose the inner workings of professional wrestling through the media, which left a ripple effect on the business in neighboring Montreal and took a toll on ticket sales. By the mid-1930s, Jack Ganson would officially claim the Montreal territory and began promoting shows in the area, but it was an uphill battle, with ticket sales at an all-time low. Over the course of the entire 1936 season, wrestling took in only about $60,000. The Montreal Gazette, in October of 1937, reported that professional wrestling under the promotion of Jack Ganson had only drawn over $100,000 and more than $71,000 so far that year, with 7 shows remaining. On August 8, 1939, Eddie Quinn arrived from Boston promoter Paul Bowser's office and began to build his own promotional powerhouse with Yvon Robert. He chose to avoid the scientific wrestling favored by Jack Ganson, the previous promoter at the Forum, instead of what he called pink wrestling. Quinn pushed gimmicks, storylines, and bloody brawls. Quinn's shows began with Yvon Robert as his central attraction. Other stars in his promotion included Edouard Carpentier, Yukon Eric, and Killer Kowalski. At one point, Gorgeous George was brought in for a series of matches against Yvon Robert. Another famous match featured boxer Jersey Joe Walcott facing wrestler Buddy Rogers, which Rogers won in the 3rd round. In fact, Quinn tried an early experiment by not only reviving the Masked Marvel character, but actually having him win the AWA Montreal title from Vic Christie in a June 9, 1938 match in Toronto. He dropped it a little over 3 months later to Yvon Robert in Montreal. The fan response was encouraging, especially for a rematch. During the 1940s, Quinn and Robert, along with a cast of regulars that included Thez and Bobby Manigoff, drew steadily, increasing houses at the Montreal Forum. Robert even managed to sneak in an NWA world title reign when he defended Wild Bill Longson at the Forum on October 7, 1942. For almost 2 months, Robert was a dual champion, as he also held the Montreal Championship. He dropped the NWA belt to Manigoff November 27th in Houston, Texas, but continued to rule Quebec for the rest of the decade. Wrestling in Quebec really begins with Yvon Robert, who is generally regarded as the greatest superstar the province ever produced. Holding many regional titles over the course of his career, Robert was also a world champion and even headlined numerous cards in Europe. Robert started wrestling in 1932 at the age of 17. He got his first stint in Boston with promoter Paul Bowser's American Wrestling Association. In 1935, he made his National Wrestling Association debut as Yvon the Lion Robert. It was a territory of the National Boxing Association to sanction professional wrestling. He got his first big exposure after attacking world champion Dano O'Mahony during a match. He left the promotion in 1936. In his home province of Quebec, was a true legend on equal footing with hockey's Maurice Rocket Richard. Partnering with promoter Eddie Quinn, it was Robert who spearheaded the incredible popularity of wrestling in Montreal right up to the moment he retired. Beginning in the late 1930s right up to the 1950s, the city, despite claims by other hot territories of the era, really was the mecca of the pro wrestling game. In April 1936, during his time in Montreal, he won the Montreal Heavyweight Championship 16 times between 1936 and 1956. Robert returned to the American Wrestling Association in July of 36, just 2 weeks after his return, defeated O'Mahony to win the AWA World Heavyweight Championship in Montreal, claiming his first world title. He was recognized as the first champion in New England and by the Montreal Athletic Commission. Robert was stripped in December 1937 for not defending against Lutte. In 1940, he left the AWA for a second time. In 1940, he also started his second stint with the NWA. On October 7, 1942, he again beat Wild Bill Longson to win the NWA World Heavyweight Championship in Montreal, Quebec. On November 27th, he lost the title to Bobby Mangahoff in Houston, Texas. In 1943, he left the NWA. Also during 1943, he won the Montreal British Empire Heavyweight Championship. Robert returned to Montreal. In 1948, he wrestled Gorgeous George to a draw before a Montreal record gate of $21,000 and broke that record within a year. In 1953, he formed a successful tag team with Whipper Billy Watson and won the Canadian Tag Team Championship. On November 12th, Watson and Robert defeated Alan Tiny Mills at a wrestling event held in Toronto with boxing champion Joe Louis as a special guest referee. During the 1950s, Forum cards were so stacked with top-notch wrestlers from all over the world that it was extremely difficult for promising local workers to break into the upper card. Donning the mask provided an up-and-comer like Dominic DiNucci with a ready-made gimmick and an opportunity to audition against main event talent to see if he could keep up. And if things didn't work out, Quinn just put someone else under the hood to see if the next guy could cut it. Quinn decided to join the 4-year-old National Wrestling Alliance cartel of promoters in 1952. On the surface, it appeared to make sense. Robert was beginning to wind down as Montreal champion, and a new local hero had not yet been lined up. In an attempt to prove he was a team player, Quinn even downgraded the Montreal title from its world status. On October 15, 1952, a miscued knee drop from the top rope accidentally ripped challenger Yukon Eric's ear off during a title match at the Forum. The incident made headlines throughout North America and turned a budding star into the legendary Killer Kowalski overnight. Although completely unexpected, it was also the type of promotional breakthrough Eddie Quinn himself could scarcely have dreamt of. The ensuing Kowalski-Eric feud was an absolute sensation that drew record crowds in Montreal and in cities all over the continent. Suddenly, neither a local babyface champion nor the NWA World Titleist was required to pack the Forum. Kowalski was now the man and would go on to hold the Montreal title a record 11 times and continue to draw huge gates well into the 1970s. Due in large part to the huge publicity over the Kowalski-Eric incident, live wrestling from the Forum debuted on the French-language Radio-Canada network on Wednesday, January 14, 1953. Eddie Quinn was on top of the world. His TV show was consistently in the top 10 most-watched programs in the province, while his house shows at the Forum were averaging about 10,000 fans on a weekly basis. Business was so good that Quinn even scheduled annual summer outdoor shows at Delormier Downs Baseball Park, home of the famous minor league Montreal Royale team, which regularly drew in excess of 20,000 fans. Quinn was a key player in a series of events in 1957 which deliberately ruptured the undisputed NWA World Championship claim and splintered the alliance for decades to come. That year, Lutte seemingly had enough of the NWA cartel of promoters, specifically with Sam Muchnick of St. Louis, who was also NWA president, so plans were formulated for a world title switch. In Montreal, the great Yvon Robert retired and Quinn had finally found a marketable babyface where he made popular Edouard Carpentier as the heir apparent. Since Quinn owned Carpentier's contract and was on good, close terms with Thez, the NWA champ arranged to drop the world title to Edouard in Chicago on June 14th. Carpentier even posted the required $10,000 bond to ensure the belt. In order to clear the way, Edouard had dropped his Montreal title to Gene Kiniski at the Forum 2 days earlier. Quinn seemed poised to be the major player on the North American scene. He would stand to get a cut from Carpentier's title defenses while exerting some measure and direct control over the NWA World Championship. Additionally, he had a second ace in the hole for his own shows. Kowalski, who was still drawing huge houses in Montreal since 1952, was pegged to succeed Carpentier and return as local champion in Montreal. In fact, he defeated Kiniski for the belt that July 17th before 21,000 fans at the Delormier Downs Stadium. For a short time after that, at an NWA meeting, Jack Pfeiffer, a notorious and controversial promoter, was invited, for a reason which remained fuzzy to this day. Word got back to Quinn and he exploded with rage. Apparently Quinn, as well as many others, had some bad blood with Pfeiffer, and Eddie was furious that this man was being allowed back into the sphere of the NWA cartel. As a result, Quinn withdrew Montreal from the National Wrestling Alliance, and Carpentier returned the NWA title belt, resigning the championship. The NWA then had no choice but return the belt to Thez and strike Carpentier's reign from the books. Quinn then fired off a now famous letter to Muchnick, which was leaked to a New York newspaper. He wrote, "Dear Sam, I would like to explain to you again, if it is possible, to get the message through that for the past 20 years I have been fighting the cancer of the wrestling business, Jack Pfeiffer. This is the same man that tried to kill the Alliance, and he has loused up quite a few territories of NWA members, including New England, where I have $25,000 investment. You, as president of the Alliance, knows that everybody in it despises Pfeiffer and what he stands for. You, as president of the Alliance, trying to play politics with everybody in it, must realize that sooner or later you have to face the barrier. At times you are much weaker than others. If you think it is good business for the Alliance to have Jack Pfeiffer consorting and in partnership, or in conclusion, or working with certain members of the said Alliance, I think it is your duty as a man to bring this to the attention of the rest of the members. Remember, the first thing you asked me before the Alliance meeting is what I did think of the Alliance. I told you all that business-wise it was no good, as the government takes care of that. I did express my thoughts that it was a worthwhile social group, but that we should get together more often to become better acquainted on matters pertaining to business. But with you have the bold audacity to inflict Jack Pfeiffer on the members of the Alliance, socially, it is a little too much for me. Yes, I did tell Larry Mo Quinn that I was sick. In fact, I was nauseated by your conduct in allowing our common enemy to mingle with the members, thus causing them much embarrassment. I'm sure when Lutte hears about this incident, it will only convince him that he did the right thing when he left you and St. Louis in the meeting behind him. The reason I wish to get out of the St. Louis promotion is firstly, the promoter or promoters have shown no ability to promote for the past 2 years. I know you spend your time knocking Thez as a poor businessman and Longson as a dope. Sooner or later you will have to take the blame on your own shoulders. Another thing I did not like at the meeting was when that loudmouth, blatant individual, Cliff Mopin, a garbage collector of the old school, kept knocking Thez about his forthcoming trip. It struck several of us very funny that you did not stand up and defend Lou, who by the sweat of his brow has been paying your salary as long as he has been champion and was making you money when he was your partner in promotion. Getting back to Carpentier, you seem to overlook the fact that Carpentier is my personal property. He does not belong to you or the National Wrestling Alliance. He is not recognized by you or the National Wrestling Alliance. He is not recognized by you, and neither does he claim to be NWA champion. He met and defeated Lou Thez June 14th in Chicago via disqualification. In a return match in Montreal, he met and was defeated by Lou Thez July 24th. You should be able to add 2 and 2. On the next meeting held in Chicago, I understand the match was a draw. I have consulted my attorney on the matter, and they suggested that I write to you and have you return Edouard Carpentier's $10,000. What you are holding it no one seems to know. If this money has not been returned within 10 days from this date, I will have my attorneys turn this matter over to the United States Department of Justice and the St. Louis Police, care of the Bunko Squad. My attorneys seem to think this is a combination of blackmail, extortion, or grand larceny. Hope this will clarify everything. Sincerely yours, Eddie Quinn. The last paragraph signaled a potentially astonishing play by Quinn. An important note to keep in mind here is that the NWA cartel was under investigation by the U.S. Justice Department around this period. If Quinn was aware of this, his threat over the return of Carpentier's deposit was ruthlessly cunning. Since his promotional base was in Canada, any Justice Department probe in the States wouldn't have affected him greatly, and even if he didn't know what the feds were up to, the tone of his letter suggests that he at least anticipated that any cartel would be doomed because of the American antitrust laws outlawing such activities. In any event, it's clear that any such legal threats would have sent shivers up the spine of Muchnick and the NWA board for fear of having their business practices exposed and potentially destroying the kayfabe notion that wrestling matches were legitimate sporting contests. Naturally, Carpentier's deposit was returned, but that wasn't the end of the headaches for the National Wrestling Alliance. In fact, it was only the beginning. Eddie Quinn kept rolling right along following Montreal's exit from the NWA. Eddie Quinn was what many would call a high roller. His spending habits were notorious in Montreal, and he had a reputation for lavishing his friends and acquaintances with endless gifts, cash, and freebies. It is rumored that Quinn once had the largest individual phone bill in Quebec, and there wasn't a nightclub, racetrack, or sporting event that he didn't frequent, both here and in the eastern and southern United States. Needless to say, the loss of television ruined his Canadian athletic promotions company. Crowds at the Forum dwindled terribly, and Quinn had no cash reserves to weather the storm. As a result, his health suffered greatly. The combination of business stress and fast living triggered several strokes, and he finally gave up and closed shop and died on December 14, 1964. He was only 59 years old. In the early 1960s, the torch was unofficially passed from Robert to another local sensation, Johnny Rougeau. Well known as a protege of Robert's, Johnny was a popular junior heavyweight champion in Montreal and won his first international heavyweight title on November 7, 1961 in, of all places, Ottawa by defending the villainous Hans Schmidt, who would be Johnny's bitter rival throughout most of the decade. He lost the belt some 8 months later to Killer Kowalski, but his reputation as a babyface headliner was solidified. In 1961, filmmakers set out to expose the wrestling business when a random encounter with French philosopher Roland Barthes changed their mind. Barthé was appalled by what they were planning to do and spoke urgently about the beauty and social role of pro wrestling in the lives of ordinary people. Persuaded by Barthé, the filmmaker set out to make a film that captured the spectacle of the sport without judging it, shot in the Montreal Forum as well as wrestling parlors where would-be wrestlers learned and practiced their craft. The film shows the wrestling arena to be sort of a modern-day shrine, with wrestling and its rituals taking the place of religion. La Lutte, also known by its English title Wrestling, was produced by Jacques Bobet for the French program brand of the National Film Board of Canada. It was nominated for multiple awards. Ironically, Johnny Rougeau would leave the wrestling world shortly after that as the business began to suffer a severe decline in Quebec. The situation bottomed out when Carpentier vacated the international title in 1964 for more lucrative paydays elsewhere. The same month, Quinn passed away. In the meantime, Rougeau had become a successful nightclub entrepreneur, but the nightclub circuit in Montreal was waning as well, and with Quinn gone, the position of promoter was now wide open and Johnny made his move. With an initial investment of $50,000 and a solid French-language television deal with CFTM Channel 10, Rougeau formed Eastern Sports Enterprises in 1965 and dubbed his promotion All-Star Wrestling. Rougeau wisely ventured out cautiously and set up his home base in the modest Paul Soave Centre in the East End of Montreal. He then proceeded to recruit an interesting mix of veteran workers such as Antonio Rocca, Larry Moquin, and Tony Angelo to headline over lesser talent and a few imports from other Canadian provinces. The sensible decision was also made to continue the lineage of Quinn's international heavyweight title, tying the new company to Quebec's rich wrestling history. Initially, following the traditional booking path of mixing local names with well-known American veterans, the atmosphere generated by Expo 67 saw Rougeau initiate the angle of Quebec versus the world, which the greatest wrestlers from all around the globe would come and challenge the local superstars. On October 23, 1967, 5 days before Expo closed, the Sheik, billed as hailing from Syria, defeated Gino Brito in a tournament final for the All-Star International title, thus ushering in the new promotional direction. In 1968, Joe Leduc hit the Quebec wrestling scene with one of the biggest bangs ever seen up until that time. It was just before a climatic 2 out of 3 falls match between Johnny Rougeau and the hated Waldo Von Erich at the Paul Soave Centre that a new tag team was introduced to Montreal fans. Paul and Joe Leduc, two lumberjack brothers from Godbout, Quebec, received a standing ovation and took their seats at ringside to watch the main event. What followed next could serve as a blueprint on how to draw major heat from a new arrival in a territory. Rougeau and Von Erich split the first 2 falls and were allowed to return to their respective dressing rooms for a 5-minute rest in between. Throughout the bout, the Leducs made it clear to the fans that they were on local hero Rougeau's side by openly cheering him and even heading to his dressing room during the first break to check on his condition. Then something strange happened. During the break before the third and deciding fall, Paul Leduc disappeared backstage for a few minutes. When the participants returned to the ring, Von Erich gestured for the Leducs to come over and talk, but they refused. All seemed well, but 15 minutes into the deciding fall, Waldo tossed Johnny out of the ring, and the Leducs rose once again to help their fellow Quebecer, or so it seemed. Instead, they removed their jackets and viciously attacked Rougeau, kicking and stomping him. Von Erich joined in and Johnny was soon a bloody mess. The fans in attendance, outraged, began littering the air with chairs and some even stormed the ring. The Leducs were soon surrounded and couldn't leave until 4 cars of policemen were called in to escort them back to the dressing room. By now, a full-scale riot was in progress and the Leducs found themselves trapped in the dressing room. An emergency call for 5 more police cars went out as fans rampaged throughout the arena. Street violence was quite common in Montreal during that era. This was the same year Pierre Trudeau, who would be elected as Prime Minister of Canada the following day, was pelted one night with rocks and bottles as he sat in the dignitary's box to view the annual Saint Jean-Baptiste parade by a gang of radical Quebec separatists. Back inside the Paul Soave Centre, it was pure bedlam, as cars were now being overturned. Main streets around the area were blocked off well into the early hours of the morning. By 4 a.m., a journalist finally managed to smuggle Joe and Paul out of the center in the back of a car. In total, 14 police cars were called and thousands of dollars in damages were incurred. Despite the mayhem outside the ring, those were the glory days for Johnny Rougeau's All-Star Wrestling program. The year of 1968 saw Montreal-born Ivan Koloff become the Russian Bear and engage in a feud with Rougeau, which broke attendance records at the Forum and electrified the province. Rougeau's next creation was an Ontario-born fellow named Larry Shreve, who was soon transformed into the madman from Sudan, Abdullah the Butcher, probably the most successful heel character in Quebec wrestling history. Other stars that would frequent the area included Fritz von Raschke, Danny Lynch, Mr. X, Carlos Roca, Tiger Jeet Singh, Don Serrano, and countless others. Rougeau's popularity as a wrestler, floating in and out of retirement several times, and now as a promoter, soared. His involvement in the Quebec Junior Hockey League furthered his reputation around the province as well. But Johnny's most significant idea was to build his promotion around the Rougeau family name, starting with the recruitment of his brother Jacques Sr. and followed soon after by his son Raymond, billed publicly as his nephew. Johnny implemented this concept well before Stu Hart did in Calgary or Fritz von Erich did in Dallas. During the latter half of the decade, Johnny Rougeau's All-Star Wrestling Group had the province all to itself. By 1969, the promotion was at the peak of its powers, drawing record crowds to the weekly cards at the Paul Soave Centre, bigger shows at the Montreal Forum, and in cities throughout Quebec. Even though the company was based around local stores like Johnny Rougeau, his brother Jacques, Gino Brito, Edouard Carpentier, Hans Schmidt, and Waldo von Erich, imported superstars like Bruno Sammartino and the Sheik were brought in to great public acclaim. Two of the most successful heels of that period were Abdullah the Butcher and Fidel Castillo, managed by Eddie the Brain Creechman. Together they captured the promotion's tag team titles on September 29, 1969 at the Montreal Forum on the undercard of a Jacques Rougeau-Ivan Koloff International Heavyweight Championship main event. Abdullah's Quebec history is well known, but many old-school fans may not realize that Castillo, while a hated heel, became a legend in his homeland where he was known as Hurricane Castillo. But in Quebec during the late 60s, he was considered as the second top heel in the territory next to Abdullah himself. One of the main reasons Puerto Rican wrestlers began to score huge heel heat in Montreal was usually they were passed off as Cubans. This was during the height of the Cold War, and the infamous Cuban Missile Crisis was less than a decade removed. So Russians and Cubans began slowly replacing the tried and true World War II Nazi German heels. Castillo was really the first of his breed to hit Quebec rings and was probably the most successful. Sure enough, Jacques Sr. was handed the torch following Johnny's swan song in the early 1970s, and all seemed well. 1969 signaled the beginning of a decline in All-Star Wrestling's fortunes. Most of the usual stars were still around, but the company lacked a hot feud to slot in the top of the card. Koloff, Abdullah, and Jacques Sr. were most often the names at the top of the marquee, while Bill Curry, Paul Diamond, the mighty Igor, Eric the Red, and the great Kojika all made an impact in that same year, as did returning Dominic DiNucci. But the story of the year was the triumphant return of Maurice Vachon that June from his serious car accident injuries. He was a little tentative in single bouts, but soon settled into a tremendously successful tag team with his brother Paul.